Alrighty, so now that I have the recorder going, going back to a couple things I already said, in an ideal world, this would be a different PowerPoint. Some of the slides later on when we do talk about some actual environs, some actual ecosystems, I'm just going to blend in with the previous lecture, basically 6.1. There's a feeble attempt in the beginning here to explain why we've separated out these aquatic ecosystems from the terrestrial ones, but I think at our level, you know, all things being equal, makes more sense to just keep all the ecosystems together in one conversation and in one test. What that boils down to is there may be a handful of slides in here that I'm just going to skip over and say please ignore. For those of you that have printed out the handouts and are following along with them, you know, feel free literally just to put an X over it if I say so. We're not going to worry about that right now. Maybe we'll come back to this, so on and so forth. So, yeah. So, again, well, we had previously talked about terrestrial ecosystems. Again, think tundra, deciduous forest, tropical rainforest, so on and so forth. Okay. Now we're moving on to a separate section here for the aquatic ecosystems. But it's very derived and tangentiated. My opinion. But again, I wrote this, so I'm allowed to say it sucks. Or at least it's not helpful. In its present form. So right off the bat, here's the deal. For whatever reason, the ecologists, and I'm not even sure how many of them agree on this or not, but the ecologists don't use the word biomes when we're talking about the aquatic systems. They call them aquatic life zones. And that just, you know, as I would have used to say, whatever, dude. It's the same dang thing, okay? So that's the main reason that this is separated off as a separate conversation. Why do we do that? Well, temperature is not as important. Okay. For a very decent amount of time, they were very concerned that they overfished the cod off of Massachusetts, that whole area over there, and cod fishing was doomed as we know it. And that's when you started seeing all kinds of other strange fishes showing up on your Friday fish fries, like orange roughy and I forget what the other one was. I just had some a week or two, a couple Fridays ago. Arguably, it's still just a plain white fish, but there's some differences here or there. But the main reason was that, oh my God, we're running out of cod. What did we do? Da, 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 da. Well, somebody somehow figured out that, you know what, we didn't overfish the cod. They just moved out another mile because the water was too warm next to the coast. And then once they figured that out, then they realized that it wasn't worth the gas money because they'd have to jack up the price. It was more than a mile, but whatever it was. They'd have to spend more money to get out to the fish. They'd have to spend more time to get back, which would raise the cost of the fish, and then people wouldn't want to buy the fish. So we didn't run out of cod. They're just not economically feasible again because they relocated. Also, we talk about temperature changes and algal blooms and so on and so forth. I'm not disagreeing with the textbook, but I'm just saying temperature is still important. Precipitation. Well, yes, obviously it doesn't rain underwater. So there's another reason that they separated it out. Okay. So again, this is the why for why it gets its own separate lecture. Salinity is incredibly important now. And arguably, you know, you all know that you can't take a saltwater fish and put it in fresh water and expect it to be happy. You can't take a freshwater fish and put it in salt water and expect it to be happy. With one known exception, well-known exception at any rate. What's one fish that could span them both? There are, okay, two fish. Sometimes a shark will slowly make its way upstream and scare the hell out of some fishermen or some folks on a dock. But I was thinking something else and actually much more local-ish. Up towards Oswego way in Mexico and all that. No? No? Salmon.
Oh, yeah.
Salmon. So that's rare. Okay. But yeah, salinity is very important. So this is why. And again, these are good reasons, even if I'm picking one or two of them apart. But still, biome, you know, biome works just fine. This is somebody who's writing a paper in grad school somewhere saying, you know, we really ought to make this a separate thing. So what do we worry about instead? Instead of precipitation or lack thereof and temperature or lack thereof, when we're talking about aquatic environments, we're talking about salinity. Dissolved oxygen is also important. You guys know that fish breathe, right? You don't necessarily think about it, but that's what the gills are for, so on and so forth. So they rely still on oxygen. It's just dissolved into the water, and they have special features, functions, whatever you want to say, excuse me, to extract it and still get it into their lungs. So, into their bloodstream, I should say. Dissolved oxygen. Temperature, as I pointed out, is still important. pH, okay? We don't want to dissolve our little fishies, but also you don't want it to be too basic either. And then, what kind of environment is it? I will most frequently use the word high energy, because I bring that with me out of the paleo world. We talk about how shells are often destroyed on the tidal areas, okay, because of the waves constantly going back and forth. So you don't see a whole lot of preservation, at least decent preservation, in that area because it's a high energy environment. Same thing in a stream. If a deer falls into a stream, okay, it's very unlikely to be buried all articulated in one piece together and so on and so forth, because it's a stream's going to flow the deer around, little pieces, parts here and there. So waves or currents is something to think about. It definitely affects your lifestyle, whether you constantly have to fight against a current or fight against the waves. Again, if you've had the opportunity to go to the beach, you can see this firsthand. Those tiny little clams, okay, that are on the shore. Every time the wave comes in, it washes away the first layer of sand. Those little guys, what's the first thing they do is dig themselves right back down. That gets tiring, okay? All day long, you got to fight against those things. You get a break when the tide goes out. Arguably, you get a little break when the tide goes in, depending on how it falls. But that's a high energy environment, and that affects think about all the stuff we've talked about in the background, your metabolism, the food cycle, all that stuff, versus hanging out in a pond. Okay, completely different energy requirements necessary. Or whether you glue yourself to a rock. So, anywho, so that's why that matters. And no, I'm not talking myself out of my premise that I made earlier. I still think these should be combined with the other environments, but. So let's talk about salinity. Salinity is more than just salt. Okay, I think we've touched on that before. And again, if you've had a mouthful of the ocean, you know that does not taste like salt water that you may have had to gargle with from your doctors or whatever, right? In addition to salt that you know and love, which is the sodium chloride there, we've got magnesium sulfate, potassium nitrate, sodium bicarbonate. That one sounds a little familiar. I'm not going to have you regurgitate these. I'm just trying to show you some other salts that are out there.
I think I also showed you this when we did the water. Did we talk about the water cycle in here? Yeah, I thought so. And again, arguably that should have been now. When did we do that? What test was it on? Was it just on third test? Huh. I wonder why I split that up from this. So I probably had some time to kill, and I wanted to, yeah, which is a good reason, arguably. But yeah, I had some time to fill, and I didn't want to put anything too heavy on you guys. So that was good. At least it was last Tuesday. Then it serves as a lead into this stuff. So you saw this diagram. Then it's sideways, which is harder to read. But I was used to those dinky little screens, wherein this picture upright would have been significantly smaller. Probably in this case, I could have left this well, let's actually see. Oh, I can't grab a corner. There we go. Fine print is still pretty fine. But so at any rate, we just talked about this the other day, so I don't want to belabor it. But what we've got here basically is the dissolved solids, the salts, as we'll call them again. Imagine that there are 1,000 water molecules in this bottle. How many of them do you need to be considered each of these levels of saltiness? All right, all the way down from fresh water. And even below fresh water, we have this level of drinking water, which is really, really small, 0.1 parts per thousand, whereas fresh water comes in at 0.5. So, it's even, a good bit better. I don't want to say better quality. That's the only word I'm coming up with, but, less dissolved solids, ideally. All the way up to brackish water. Brackish, we're going to talk about some words very soon, like estuaries, where we have fresh and saltwater mixing. Basically, think of a bay-type environment where a river or stream is entering into the oceans, and you're going to get that mix of fresh and salt, and that's where our friends the sharks take advantage of that, because sometimes, depending on the way stuff is flowing or the tides are coming, the salinity moves. So you could go further upstream and be more saline, or the river can be stronger, maybe after a big heavy rain, and then your salinity will fade the other direction. But that's brackish. And growing up, I always thought that brackish was the really salty stuff. That's brine. Okay. When you're at the brine level, you're thinking about the Dead Sea or Salt Lake in Utah, and so on and so forth. And then we have good old-fashioned salt water there in the middle. I know the temptation is to assume that they're also trying to show us percent composition, so to speak, representation, especially when you see the little bit of fresh water at the bottom there. And I think this is on Tuesday a route I did take. I still kind of hold to that, with the exception of I would think maybe brackish and saline would switch widths, heights, whatever. I'd like to think there's more truly oceanic water than there is brackish water, but there's an awful lot of coastline. So, we do have a lot of opportunities for fresh and salt to mix. But I don't think that's the implication. And again, brine is a relatively small portion. So maybe it's an undertone that they were going for without actually stating it, but the numbers, again, aren't representation of that. They're more of the dissolved solids. So. Okay, so we've used the word niche before. You know that a niche is how you make your living or a lifestyle. We use it kind of loosely to mean a handful of things. In the aquatics conversation, we refer to basically they're almost places. 3 places you can live.
They're more like genres, I suppose. Because genres are vague and wide, and jazz music can be a lot of things. Some of it you might like, some of it you're like, oh my God, I can't stand that. But it's all loosely considered jazz or rock and roll for whatever, Pop music, that's all over the place. And so, plankton, nectin, and benthos. Okay, you might know the word benthic. It's just conjugated slightly differently here. Basically, you've got floaters, swimmers, and crawlers / burrowers. Plankton float, nectin swim, nekton, say nectin, nekton swim, and the benthos are the critters crawling around on the bottom or, as we said, burrowing down in. So, plankton. As I said, plankton float. They can swim a little bit, some of them. And that's usually used, good, I have it on here, usually used for migrating up and down in the water column. All right. They still need to eat, right? And they want to eat when it is a great time for them not to get eaten. So one of the things that scientists have noticed that they do is that they come up at night. So I was lucky enough to, my parents, as I look back, were incredibly awesome and patient with my college career. One summer I had the wonderful opportunity to go to a island in the middle of Lake Erie. Ohio State was running a marine lab on. We always joked about that. I know Lake Erie was highly polluted, but it certainly wasn't saltwater. But they called it a marine lab. One of the things we did was go out in the middle of the day into a boat and capture some water, and we did a plankton count, similar to like you guys do in lab when you do your macroinvertebrate study, okay, or even your microinvertebrate study. We were mainly doing a head count, though. And then we went out to essentially the same area. I don't know, it was dark, and it was 30 years ago, so I don't remember exactly. But later at night, all right? And we did the same thing, and it was, quadrupled the amount of critters were there. And they were just trying to show us that, there's this migration. They want to come up and feed. Who eats what? Well, we got two kind of plankton down there. We'll talk about that in a moment. But, and obviously some are capable of movement and some just have to go with the flow. But the vertical migration was a real thing. And what are they hiding from? They're hiding from, well, the fishes. And that assumption then also supports the idea that, the fish were sleeping, okay, or at least less active. Because if they were smart, and fish also aren't incredibly bright, because they would say, oh, well, all the plankton are out at night. If I'm really hungry, I'm going to go hunting at night. So we got two kinds of plankton. We've got phytoplankton and zooplankton. All right. I know we've spent a whole lot of time reminding you that plants are alive. So, they're both alive, but plants, generally speaking, aren't, capable of movement. So the phyto is the plant, and the zoo is the critters, okay? And they're both plankton because they both float. So our little friend here from SpongeBob, is he phytoplankton or zooplankton? I can't hear you, but I assume you're saying zooplankton because he walks and talks. The fact that he's green, they're really throwing you off there. But who's the creator on that one? Was it Hildebrand? I forget. It's been a while since my kids have watched SpongeBob. Huh? Sorry, I talked to him.
Steven Hillenburg.
Hillenburg, yeah. He was a marine biologist. So, in a former life, was a marine biologist. So he had some credit here. arguably, he made one huge mistake. The sponge should have been dumber than the starfish, but you know, it probably just worked better the other way. So you got to do what you got to do. But yeah, he should have. You know, it's not to say that some of the zooplankton don't carry on a little photosynthesis here or there, but he's colored like phytoplankton, but he presumably is zooplankton since he walks and talks and eats Krabby Patties. So, all right. So the zooplankton travel up to eat the phytoplankton. The phytoplankton need to be by the sunlight. Sun only goes so far down in the water. You'll learn about that eventually. Right? So they're migrating to get the phytoplankton when the fish aren't there to eat them. The fish will eat both kinds of plankton if given the opportunity. Phytoplankton's always there. You follow? Okay. So for phyto, what are we looking at? We're looking at photosynthetic algae and or cyanobacteria. Zooplankton, a handful of words you've probably heard before. Protozoa, there's a lot of one. There's a poster down the hallway outside of the bio lab. Not your environmental science lab, but the next door down. You see many of those critters. You're like, oh yeah, I know those. You know, the hydra, they're all jumping out of my head. Radiolarian, foraminiferas, those guys. You all know them. So that's your protozoa. Your crustaceans, they can be really, really tiny, okay? You're used to thinking of you know, lobsters and crabs and whatnot. In grad school, I started out studying, it was essentially a tiny little crab in a clamshell, ostracods. There, I couldn't think of the name for a minute. And it was they were visible to the naked eye, but you still needed a microscope. And you had to basically pick at this tiny little tray of bigger than sand, smaller than gravel, with a paintbrush, fine little paintbrush, picking out sand grains from ostracods. And oh my God, I hated it. Absolutely hated it. I was not set out to be a micropaleontologist. So luckily another instructor took me under his wing and gave me some big old clunky horse bones or zebra bones to look at. But point being, there's a whole lot of crustaceans you don't know about that are out there, and super tiny ones too. And then the larval stages of many, 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 many organisms. We've had many fish tanks over the years, but you want to scare yourself, put some of your fish tank or aquarium water under a microscope one of these days and see what's floating around in that water. We had some issues. We were having issues with our tank, and being, you know, the people that we are, we said, hey, let's look under the microscope and see what's in there. There's a lot of crazy stuff. Some we were able to identify, some we weren't, and one that was super prevalent. We're like, okay, maybe this is what's making our fish sick. And come to find out it was mosquito larvae. And of course, you guys all know, you know, not to let, and we knew too, outside, standing water, it's a breeding pit for mosquitoes. Mosquitoes start as an aquatic lifestyle. Never occurred to us that, you know, we had apparently that many mosquitoes in our house, or at least one or two that laid some eggs. So there's all kinds of stuff under zooplankton, okay? All kinds of stuff. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit more about both of them. So the plankton, it's the aquatic food chain, basically. The zooplankton eat the phytoplankton. We already talked about that. And then the zooplankton are eaten by the baby fish, and the medium fish eat the baby fish, and the bigger fish eat both of them. And then you're all aware, you know, that there are some, I won't call them oddities, but some exceptions to that rule out there. You've got the giant whale that just eats, you know, 5,000 tons of algae, filters it out through their special teeth, takes in mouthfuls of water,
The plankton stay behind as the water slooshes out. So this is the aquatic version then of grass absorbs sunlight. Okay, the phytoplankton are absorbing the sunlight in this case. The bunny eats the grass. The wolf eats the bunny. All right, same thing, just different. Maybe I'll ask you guys when you're done, when we're done, if I should keep this as a separate conversation or blend it into the terrestrial one. So the nectin, moving on. We good with plankton? You guys got any questions, plankton? So when I went back talking about that some can swim, they got a little flagella, okay, for lack of a better word. Just think of your tadpole, but really tiny, okay? And, you know, a wave comes in, it's definitely going to overpower them. They have enough to move up and down, maybe a little bit left or right, but they're not strong enough to, you know, they'd pass the swim test. They wouldn't pass the swim test at camp kind of thing, okay? Nectin, on the other hand, by comparison, are strong swimmers. Again, that doesn't mean that a wave can't batter them back and forth, so on and so forth. But, you know, we got fish, we got turtles, we got whales, and there's a whole bunch of stuff I'm not mentioning. So nectin, again, obviously what you would assume swimmers meant. And there's many things in between. I didn't list eels, okay, and you know, so on and so forth. I didn't list dolphins and whatnot, but you get the idea. I don't know why this isn't clicking. So the benthos. Benthos, if you're wondering why we conjugate different, benthos sort of refers to the organisms that live in the benthic area. The benthic is a location. The benthos are the organisms. Again, loosely translated. With a lot of these words, if you notice that 3/4 of the word is the same and they just change a little prefix or a suffix, you know you're in the right realm, okay? There's just a little bit here or there that something slightly subtly different that it means. So benthos, this means the bottom dwellers. And I did mention, originally I mentioned just walking or burrowing, but eventually I got to there are some organisms that glue themselves down. So we have three ways to be, three niches really, that you could find, sub-niches that you could find to be a bottom dweller. The fixed organisms. You've got your sponges, your oysters, and your barnacles. Okay, sponge fishermen, sponge harvesters, that is definitely a trade out there, and they go down, you know, with a knife and literally cut the sponges off of the rocks or whatever bed they happen to be, substrate they happen to be attached to. Sometimes it's a coral reef or something like that. The oysters, of course, they're attached to anything and everything, including themselves. If you've ever been to the beach and you've got a rock washed up, those oysters aren't just attached to the rocks, they attach themselves to each other as well. Barnacles, you may have seen on at the shore, but you've definitely seen on TV. They're always grumbling if it's some sort of ocean setting, inevitably. You know, they're grumbling about or showing barnacles off in the distance. These are the things on the giant pillars encrusted on there. These are the things that are often they grow on whales even sometimes. You know, they just attach themselves wherever they are. They look like little volcanoes, okay? They're pretty cool. They're a bivalve, which means they are related to clams and stuff. They have a little top on them, but the volcano part is their bottom shell, and there's this little critter that comes in and out of there. Pretty cool stuff. So those are your fixed. Clams, okay, different than oysters. If you eat that stuff, you know. If you don't eat them, you might just lump them all together. And scallops are totally different, even though they come in 2 shells as well. All right. So all those are different things. Scallops can actually swim, for lack of a better word. So that's your. So oysters are different. Burrowers, you've got your worms, clams, as we talked about earlier in the conversation. They burrow back down into the sand. It's best not to get eaten by seagulls that way. And sea cucumbers. Sea cucumbers are really bizarre critters. I hope I have a picture in here later. If not, we'll Google one, or you can Google one later. Funky little things. And the walkers. Starfish. Starfish can move, and they're very, very awesome. In another life, I would have studied starfish. They have a hydrovascular system, okay, for instead of muscles. We have muscles that help us move, okay? They have this system of pipes and valves where they suck, they have little suckers on their arms, right? So they suck water in through there, and then they let it out in various ways and retain it in other ways to allow their arms to move, and allows them to move. Also, and what's amazing beyond that is that it's strong enough to do things like pry a clam apart. Very, very amazing organisms. Crawfish, crayfish, depending where you grow up, call them different things. Lobsters, okay, similar to that. So those are your walkers. And again, you're probably thinking of many, many things that I didn't cover, and you're probably right guessing what they are. So we've talked about the 3 lifestyles. This has mostly been saline, okay? But please keep in mind that many of these niches, are filled in freshwater as well. All right. I remember being a kid, being amazed that there was a stream down at the end of our street that we'd always go play in and around, and there were freshwater clams in there. All right. Maybe you've seen in some of the lakes around here. Certainly with zebra mussels. Now, zebra mussels are everywhere. Nobody's surprised by that anymore. But before zebra mussels, there were other freshwater clams and whatnot that were around. Obviously, worms, we have plenty of. But there's walkers in freshwater as well. More on the insect end of things, crayfish aside. So we've got freshwater equivalents of a lot of these. Okay. Benthos is a little harder to imagine, though. But obviously the plankton and the nectin, yeah, there's fish, there's plankton. So, but for the benthos, it's a little harder to picture. So those are your niches. All right, this is starting where I'm going to skip. So this is slide, it looks like 13. Can't tell if it's 12 or it is 13. So right now I'm just skipping over. Well, we're going to do this slide. So freshwater environments, we have a couple things to think. We have streams, we have lakes, and we have wetlands. Now, caveat, asterisk, however you want to say it. In earth science, we use the word stream for anything and everything that flows. River, creek, brook, stream. When we use those words as normal humans, we're generally implying size, right? So they don't necessarily care how big or small a stream is in general conversation. So at some point, they arbitrarily decided just to use the word streams for all flowing bodies of, unidirectional flowing bodies of water, okay? Because every so often we'll go through this, and after like 45 minutes, someone will raise their hand and say, well, does this work for a river too, or for a creek too? So now I just start by saying that, okay? All those are fine. Oh, it's the topo maps lab. That's where it usually gets it. Someone will raise their hand and is like, I'm only seeing creeks on here. I don't see anything called a stream. No, it's good. And some of you may have asked that question in lab. So yeah, streams is just whatever. Lakes, again, similarly, whether it's a pond or just so it's not man-made, usually. And the same goes for streams. We would not call the canal a stream. So size doesn't matter in this case. Wetlands, again, we're generalizing. What are we talking about? Marshes or swamps, let alone, legit what you would call a wetland that's merging on a, I'm sorry, another style of wetland that is merging on the ocean, but we're under freshwater. That's why it's not included here. So these are inland wetlands. In case we don't get to it, what's the big difference between a marsh and a swamp? There's one huge honking difference. Nope. Not the amount of water. Trees. Marshes are mostly grasses. Swamps have trees. And again, going back to, and this is something we've touched on a lot, the not just organisms can evolve, but ecosystems can evolve. So it depends where you're going. If you're flooding out a or in wetting an old foresty area versus an old field or grassland, okay, which you're going to end up with. And sometimes the trees continue to live. Some trees are more tolerant of this, but generally speaking, we've all overwatered a house plant. Okay, we know that they have tolerances for this stuff. You do have very special vegetation that works in either case. And pardon the not exactly a pun, but pardon the pun, they sort of get weeded out along the way naturally as this area slowly gets more and more wet. The stuff that isn't tolerant dies out. The stuff that can deal with it stays behind. So marsh versus swamp, primarily trees. So now when you're driving down the thruway and somebody says, "Oh, look, a marsh," you could say, "No, that's a swamp because look at all the trees." And they'll be so thrilled for your information. Okay, definitely skipping streams for now. So slide 14, 15, 14 and 15 we're skipping. I want to talk about turnover though. Fudge. The reason I'm considering this is because in freshwater they use one set of vocabulary, and when we get to marine, they use a separate set of vocabulary for the same areas. And it's confusing as heck for you guys as a aquatic biology was one of my minors, but as a non-aquatic biologist, I find it annoying that they need to distinguish between the two. Let's just acknowledge that they break lakes down into zones or areas, okay? We're not going to worry about the vocabulary right now. You have near shore, you have middle of the lake, and you have bottom of the lake. Capiche? I mean, that makes sense, right? And in those areas, one could easily assume that life is different. Some lakes are big enough to have waves. Think about Oneida Lake. Think about if you've been up to Lake Ontario. If you haven't been to Lake Ontario yet, you live like an hour and a half from it. Drive up to Oswego this summer, go to Rudy's, get a hot dog, and stare at Lake Ontario. Try to get there around sunset. It's amazingly beautiful, all right? And it's not that far away. It's a big honking lake. Some lakes are big enough to have waves, some aren't. That's going to affect how you live at the shoreline. Remember, we talked about high energy versus low energy, okay? Out in the middle of the lake, you got to worry about a couple things. One, bigger fish, obviously, that want to eat you. and not as a human, as a fish living out there. And also, you know, those bigger fish need to think about things. They have to have more food available for them in order to live there, and so on and so forth. We also have the fact that the sun doesn't necessarily make it all the way down to the bottom.